we needed a way to incentivize conservation on private property. So he got the Governors Association together, and conservation districts were set up in each state across the US. They're a little bit different in each state though. In Montana, conservation districts roughly follow the county lines, so that's why we're called the Flathead Conservation District. And if you remember from your history lessons back in high school, the Dust Bowl was largely caused by poor farming practices on private property. The tractor had recently been invented, and people were doing a lot of tilling and sod busting in areas that they probably shouldn't have been. And that, coupled with long-term drought, led to the loss of a lot of our topsoil and some really bad environmental consequences. So to get our major food producing areas back up and running, conservation districts were created with the mission of conserving soil and water resources on private property. So here in the Flathead, we do a lot of that through landowner assistance programs and education programs. We have a variety of programs where we offer either technical or financial assistance to landowners. And if you have any questions about those programs specifically, we can talk about those in the discussion session at the end. We're going to talk about one of those programs in particular tonight, and that is the Flathead Pollinator Initiative. So stay tuned for information on that. And with that, we'll jump into pollinators. So tonight for my presentation, here's the outline. We're going to go over some pollinator basics, including biology and life cycles, and some identification. Those of you who are experts in pollinators already, this might be a bit of a refresher for you, but for those of you that are unfamiliar, it's helpful to have this background knowledge as we start talking about pollinator habitat. So you'll really get a better idea of why pollinators need the different types of habitat that we'll be talking about. So we'll go into understanding those needs, and then we'll talk about the 3 things that you can do at home. That'll sort of tie it all together and be those key takeaway points. And then, like I mentioned, we'll talk about the Flathead Pollinator Initiative, and then we'll wrap up with some additional resources that you guys can check out for more information if you want to. And then at the very end, as Michaela mentioned, we'll do a discussion and a question and answer session. All right, well, let's talk about those pollinator basics. Let's start with a refresher of what pollination is. So pollination is basically when pollen, which contains the genetic information for plants, is transferred from one flower to the next. It's transferred from the anther, which is the male part of the flower, to the stigma, which is the female part of the flower, via a vector or a pollinator. So pollinators can be anything that is transferring that pollen from one plant to the next. Most of the time when we talk about pollinators, people think of a bumblebee or a honeybee like is pictured in this graphic here. But pollinators can be all sorts of different animals. It's anything that could potentially transfer that pollen back and forth. So in Montana, we've got a variety of different pollinators. Insects by far make up the largest group of our pollinators, but we also have vertebrate pollinators such as birds, bats, small mammals such as mice and voles. And then when we talk about our insect pollinators, which is going to be the bulk of what we talk about in the discussion here tonight, don't think of just bees. You also need to remember that beetles, flies, moths, and butterflies are also pollinators. Okay, so that is our brief recap of the basics of pollinators. Let's talk about why we need pollinators. So we can thank pollinators for 1/3 of every bite of food that we eat. Approximately 75% of the world's flowering plants and 35% of our food crops rely on animal pollination to reproduce. So if we didn't have pollinators doing this work for us, we wouldn't have these food sources and these flowering plants that we depend on. Pollinators are also necessary for some other raw materials, spices, fabrics, medicines, things like that, that we also wouldn't have without them. Indirectly, we rely on pollinators for clean air, healthy habitats, and even just our beautiful landscapes. Without pollinators, many of our plant communities would in fact collapse and have a major impact on our economy and our way of life. So this is really scary because we're seeing an extensive amount of development and urbanization and monoculture farming that can lead to a loss of habitat for pollinators. According to the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, at least 185 pollinator species are considered to be threatened or extinct across the world. And in the US right now, we actually have 4 bat species, 22 bird species, 8 bee species, and 30 other insect pollinator species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. So we're seeing some pretty major declines in our pollinator populations due to habitat loss and fragmentation, excessive or improper use of pesticides and insecticides, disease and parasites, and also competition from invasive species. So if these declines in pollinators and the loss of their habitat isn't reversed or stopped, we may see some major impacts to our economy and our cropland and a lot of those other things like I mentioned. So thankfully, we've got a lot of folks like everyone that's on this workshop tonight that is doing their part to help increase pollinator habitat and wants to learn how to do that. So we're going to do a very brief recap of Pollinator and Insect Biology 101. I promise there's just one slide on this. So all insects have 4 basic life stages. They start out as an egg, and then they go to larva, and then pupae, and then finally a winged adult. So they all go through the same life cycle, but when pollinators, there's a huge diversity of food sources that they need during these different life stages, and the places that they need to be, the shelter they need to be successful, and the sort of environments and habitat they need at different points in their life cycle. Some, for example, will need a host plant, like a lot of butterflies need a very specific host plant to for their larvae to eat. If they don't have that particular host plant, they may not successfully pupate and become an adult. And others, such as some bees and wasps, need a very specific food source that's provided to them by the mother or the colony. And so like for bees, a good example is they need the honey that they produce from the pollen. So all right, so then as adults, they also have a wide variety of behavior, the different ways that they use the flowers and the different sources that they're getting pollen from. A lot of people think that the main reason, or the main reason that people think of when they refer to pollinators is that they are going to flowers and they're getting that pollen, which is a really good source of food, high in sugars and proteins and fats. But there's another reason that a lot of pollinators use those flowers, and that's for courtship and for finding mates. So there's different odors and scents and signals that flowers send out that different species use to signal a mate. So those are all very important parts of their biology, and understanding this will help us create a better pollinator garden and a more effective habitat for them. So the main point of this whole slide is just to understand that during the different life stages, there's different components of habitat that they need, and there's a huge diversity in these insects as they go through this life stage. So that'll translate later into needing a huge diversity in our pollinator gardens. So we'll get into that in just a minute. All right, so this slide is kind of a joke, but it has a good point. I want to touch on the identification of our pollinators because this is really tricky. And I'm definitely not an entomologist. I'm not going to be able to tell you specifically proportions of body shape that you need to look for, or how to count the hairs on their legs to be able to tell one bee from the next. But what I can tell you is that there is a huge number of pollinators that we have in the US. In North America, we have over 4,000 species of just native bees. So you may not ever become an expert at identifying your bees, but you may be able to get the basics down. A key note is that most of the pollinators we're trying to attract to our pollinator gardens are the friendlier ones. They're the bumblebees, the honeybees, things like that, and they're generally not that aggressive. Some of the hornets and the wasps can be very aggressive. They will defend their nest sites or a food source through stinging. Our native friendlier pollinators can sting. They just will only generally sting when they're being defensive. They're not nearly as aggressive. But there's a lot of mimicry that happens in the insect world. And what I mean by that is you might have one species like the yellow jacket that has a pretty strong sting and is very aggressive. And over time, through evolution, another species may end up looking like the yellow jacket and mimicking that warning signal of the sting, so that even though they don't have a sting or their sting isn't as bad, predators learn to avoid them as well. So another example of this mimicry is with monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies are actually poisonous to predators. If a predator eats a monarch butterfly, it will essentially vomit, and that's not very pleasant. But there are other species of butterfly that are not poisonous at all, but they look similar to a monarch butterfly. So they have adapted to have similar patterns and coloring so that they're avoided by predators as well, even though they don't have that adaptation of being poisonous. So that's all to basically say that telling our pollinators apart is very, very challenging because there are thousands of them and they all look very similar. But if you want to dive into it a little bit, there are some resources out there for you. So for example, this is a just one page of the Montana Bee Identification Guide. This is one of the links on our resource list. I think Michaela's probably going to try to get a link put for you in the comment box so that you could click on that and go to the full guide. And this has got some key indicators to look for and some different characteristics of the most common of our local bees. For some of the others, some of the moths and butterflies, things like that, you'll have to look elsewhere. But this is a really good bee identification guide to get you started. Okay, so I also want to talk briefly about identifying a pollinator's nest because they're often a lot more inconspicuous than you think they are. About 70% of our native bees are actually ground nesters. So, and then also along with some of our beetles and wasps and hornets will also nest in the ground. When you're looking for a ground nest, they're surprisingly challenging to find because they are a small hole in the ground, generally about the diameter of a straw, and there's just little piles of excavated dirt around that hole. And unless you see a fly or a bee or something come out of it, you may not even recognize it as being anything. So the picture in the upper right-hand corner is the entrance to a ground nesting bee hole. And then the picture in the bottom left, you can actually see part of a bee coming out of that hole. And I can't quite tell if that's the front end or the back end of the bee, but it's there. And then we also have cavity nesters. So the bottom middle picture and the bottom right-hand picture are examples of cavity nesting bees. And these are often in trees, sometimes other material, but they will take over a hole in a dry location. And sometimes it's a rodent den that's been abandoned, or a woodpecker hole that's been abandoned, a natural cavity, that sort of thing. But you often find these in snags. So a snag is a standing dead tree, and they often have cavities in there that bees will take over. One of the other common nesting methods that we have is what's demonstrated in the upper left picture on the screen. And that is, excuse me, let me turn the page. So that is what we call a wood or pith nester. So the pith is the slightly soft inner section of woody vegetation. In some vegetation, the pith is actually hollow. In others, it's just slightly softer, but certain pollinators will burrow into the center of that pith, and as you can see in that picture, will lay their eggs all in a line on the inside of that vegetation. And we'll get into more why that's really important in a little bit. There's a couple other strategies that pollinators will use for nesting. One is they're called architects. They will actually use material that they find or material that they secrete or make themselves to produce their own nests. And then we have a couple that are predatory nesters. They will actually steal the nests from other pollinators, either of their own species or other species. We don't see those as much around here, but the ground nesters, the cavity nesters, and the wood or pith nesters are the most common strategies here. All right. So we're going to tie all of that together, the biology and the threats that they're facing and their nesting strategies. And now we're going to talk about the habitat that they need and how you can provide this for pollinators. So this is the meat of the presentation, and we're going to dive into the steps that you can take to provide the best pollinator habitat that you can for our pollinators. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to understand what our pollinators need. And the biggest one that our pollinators need is habitat through the seasons. One of the biggest threats, as we already talked about, is habitat fragmentation and loss of fragmentation, or excuse me, loss of habitat. So when we provide habitat for bees through the seasons, we need to think about bloom time, diversity, and planting mostly native. So bloom time refers to the period of time in which a plant is in bloom, right? So how do you provide that for your pollinators? Well, you need to make sure that you have a variety of plants that are in bloom from early on in the spring all the way until late fall. And if you're anything like me, you're pretty okay at plant identification. You've got a handle on what grows well in our native areas, but you're not very good at naming off the exact months that a plant is in bloom and keeping all that straight in your head. So I would recommend going to a couple of different websites where you can search through native plant databases and filter the results specifically by bloom time. So I recommend that when you're picking species, you pay attention to this so that you have I'd recommend at least 5 for the different seasons, spring, summer, and autumn, if you can manage it. Depending on your space and the size of your plot, you may not be able to get that many, but just make sure that you have at least a couple for each of those seasons. I also recommend that if you have a chance, walk around your house right now and sort of catalog all of the different plants that you have in your garden. We have a workbook that's online that you guys will all have access to. It'll be on our website after the presentation, and it's got a spot in there where you can go through and you can write down the names of all of the plants that you have, and then you can go back to one of those plant finder databases that is a couple of links are in a resource list, and Michaela's posting them in the comments. So you take that plant list and you look through those, and then you can jot down notes of the different bloom times of each of your plants. And then that way you can really make sure that you've got plants blooming through the whole season as much as you can. If all of your plants are blooming at one time, say all of your plants are late summer bloomers, then you'll have a better idea of what gaps you need to fill if you're going to plant more or provide better habitat moving forward. All right, so then the next thing that you need to be really conscientious of is providing a diversity of plants. So we talked about, at the very beginning, we talked about how there's a really big diversity of strategies that pollinators use for different stages of their life cycle. And this correlates into needing a diversity of plants in your pollinator garden if it's going to be really successful. So there's some really great studies out there, and you can find more information on the website from the Xerces Society. But there's studies out there that show if you have a pollinator garden that contains 8 or more species, you're significantly likelier to attract an abundance and a higher diversity of pollinators. So the reason that we pay a lot of attention to diversity is because our native plants and our native pollinators have evolved together, and some of our pollinators are specialists and they key into certain traits on a flower. And many of our flowers have what they call different pollinator syndromes, or this is the collection of traits that a flower puts out there that attracts different pollinators. So some of these traits might be height, color, shape, size, texture, the depth from the petal to the pollen, and also the scent of the flower. So, and as a fun fact, many of you may not have known that a lot of our flowers also have UV patterns on them that are not visible to our eyes, but many pollinators can see in the UV light spectrum. So if you happen to be out in your garden at dusk one night and you happen to have a UV light, take that out with you and see what you can see. So make sure to incorporate all of these different components into your garden so that you will be attracting not just one bee species or a couple of them, but you'll be attracting a huge diversity of pollinators to your garden and providing habitat for a wide range of those pollinators that might need it. All right, so then this point on mostly native is closely tied in with what I just talked about with diversity, of how our native plants and our native pollinators adapted to, or they evolved together and they're adapted to each other. So if you have a favorite plant and it's not native, feel free to incorporate it into your garden. There's no reason you shouldn't do that unless it's a noxious weed. But you just want to be careful and make sure that at least a majority of your plants in the garden are natives. Research demonstrates that native plants are 4 times more likely to attract native bees and significantly increase the abundance of butterflies and moths. In fact, there's been some research and studies that show a native pollinator garden as opposed to a non-native pollinator garden will attract up to 14 times more species than the non-natives. So one of the reasons that a native pollinator garden will attract the native pollinators more is because of the traits that have been cultivated out of many of the non-native species. So a lot of our introduced species and our non-native species have been bred basically to produce really big flowers or have these beautiful scents or to be very tolerant to certain conditions. But in the process, they generally don't produce the same amount of pollen that the native counterparts were. So for example, if you have the Montana native lupine, and then you have the cultivar lupine, which the cultivar comes in a variety of colors. It comes in pink and purple and all these different things, and it grows way taller than our native one does, but it doesn't provide the same amount of pollen per flower that the native does. So if you have an opportunity to go with the native, we really strongly suggest that. There are some other benefits of native plants that might be an incentive to plant them in your garden, and this is that they're generally drought tolerant. They require a lot less water. They generally don't require fertilizer, and natives are less prone to diseases and pests. So keep that in mind when you are planting your garden. Okay. So apart from just the flowers, we're also going to need to provide nesting and overwintering habitat for our pollinators. We talked about all the different nesting strategies that pollinators have, and we want to make sure to provide this as well, because if all you do is provide flowers, you provide that forage, many of our pollinators won't make it through the winter, or they won't be successful at going through their whole life cycle to reproduce and become an adult. Many of our pollinators do not migrate. Many of them overwinter here, either as an adult or just through the course of their life cycle. They lay their eggs to overwinter and emerge in the spring. So some of the hazards as a home gardener that you might not think about is clearing or cleaning up your garden in the fall, or winterizing your garden. One of the hazards of this is that you clear out a lot of that material that the pollinators are using as their nesting and overwintering habitats. So those cavity nesters that are nesting in trees like the one that's pictured here, if you were to buck up that downed tree and burn it, you would potentially be losing that habitat. Same with those nesters that nest or lay their eggs in the hollow pith of woody vegetation stems. If you winterize your garden by cutting everything down, piling it up, and putting it in the compost, you've removed that overwintering habitat. And you can feed a bee all summer long, but if you cut down its habitat to overwinter in, that whole effort has been pointless. So one of the things that you need to learn is to be okay with messy. See what I did there? Be okay. So leave things piled up, leave things standing. A great example is sunflower stalks. Those can be used by bees to burrow into and lay their eggs in. If you want a cleaner looking garden over the winter, that's fine. Clean some of it up, but leave some. Just leave some of it standing. You can also do things like, as you're gathering up brush and leaves, leave a few piled against a shed or in a corner of your garden that you don't really care about. just leave some of that material is really the important thing. You don't have to leave everything out all winter long so that your garden looks like a mess and your neighbors are complaining, but do what you can. Okay. I also want to touch on really quickly here that you can also support pollinators by providing artificial nesting locations. Many of you will have seen those bee boxes, or they're called bee motels or bee condos. And those can be really beneficial for our pollinators. But I do have a couple words of caution. Many of those kits or bee condos that are sold in hardware stores or native gardening or local gardening centers may not always be as effective as you want them to be. Some of them are made out of chemically processed wood, which can long-term be bad for the eggs, bad for the bees, that sort of thing. And many of those commercial nest blocks that are found are also made specifically for blue orchid bees, or excuse me, blue orchard bees, which we don't have here, I believe. And those have a very specific hole size of 5/8 of an inch and then a specific depth to that hole. And the danger is that if you buy one of those, our native bees will nest in them and they will lay their eggs, but the holes aren't deep enough. So what happens is the female bees can, depending on species, can select the sex of their offspring. And one of the ways they do that is by putting the eggs in the order in which they're going to emerge. And so what'll happen if the hole is too shallow in that nest block in the artificial nesting habitat is they will lay only one sex of eggs, which long-term at a population level will be detrimental. So just a couple words of caution there for buying the generic commercially made artificial nesting. If you want to make your own artificial nesting, there's some really great resources out there. The Xerces Society has a fact sheet that I would recommend. It's got a lot of information and some step-by-step instructions on not just how to build them, but also how to maintain and clean out the artificial nest boxes. It's my understanding that those artificial nest boxes, if they're not cleaned and maintained by you, they are prone to diseases and things like mites and some other issues. So read those directions. And then also, I'm going to put a shout out for this book here. This is Attracting Native Pollinators, the book by the Xerces Society. And in here, there's a whole chapter on nesting and overwintering sites and how you can build and maintain those sites artificially for your pollinators. So if that's something that you're interested in, check out those resources. And but I'm not going to get into artificial nest boxes much more than that because we simply don't really have time in this presentation. Okay, we are going to move on. All right, so these are the 3 things that if you could take a message home with you tonight, these are the 3 main points I would want you to remember. And these are the steps that you can take and do at home on your own property. So the first one is recognize the pollinators and the pollinator habitat that you already have. So we talked about pollinator identification and identification of the nesting sites. So start paying attention. Start watching for those pollinators that you have, and not just the bees, but also the flies and the beetles and the hummingbirds and the other creepy crawly bugs that you have around that are pollinators on your property. And see if you can identify them, see if you can identify what some of their habitat needs might be. And then take note of all of the habitat that you have on your property. Do you have flowers in hanging pots? Do you have blooming shrubs that border your house? Do you have a section of lawn that you could let grow or use a lawn alternative for? These are some of those options that you could think about for pollinator habitat. And once you have your list going, remember to go back and check the bloom time of your list so that you know if there's any gaps that you're missing. So if you've got your list and you know your pollinators and you've started to piece together that you've got bumblebees that are emerging early in spring and you don't have any early spring bloomers, you can fill that hole in your pollinator garden. All right, the second one is avoid causing undue harm to your existing pollinators and your pollinator habitat. So I'm going to touch on the use of chemicals here quickly. If we want to get into this a little bit more in the discussion session, we can. But the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between an herbicide and an insecticide or a pesticide. So insecticides and pesticides, as their names indicate, are designed to specifically target the systems of insects. So they have been engineered to directly affect their systems and cause immediate and irreparable harm to insects and pests. Herbicides, on the other hand, as the name implies, have been engineered to affect the systems of plants. So if you have a pollinator garden, avoid pesticides and insecticides as much as is possible. If you have to use them for whatever case, if you absolutely have to, use extreme caution. Make sure to use them during a time of day when pollinators are not active. In this book, Attracting Native Pollinators, there's some additional guidance for how you can try to use insecticides or pesticides without causing undue harm to pollinators, but it's tricky business and I really wouldn't recommend it if you can avoid it. Herbicides, on the other hand, I still don't recommend using them excessively, but they can safely be used in areas of pollinator gardens. And keep in mind, an herbicide is any chemical that's going to detrimentally affect a plant. So a good example of this is horticultural vinegar. This is an organic option that you might consider that's technically considered an herbicide, but it's not what you generally think of when people say herbicide. Most of the time people think of Roundup or some of those other herbicides that have been in the news so much lately. The herbicides won't directly affect the systems of our pollinators. So as long as you're careful and you're following the recommendations on the label and you're taking all the precautions that you can, they should be fine. Just don't use them in excess and don't use them in higher concentrate levels than you should be. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about herbicides and insecticides for now, unless we want to talk about it more in the discussion. Another way that you can avoid causing undue harm to your pollinators and your pollinator habitat is to avoid overwatering. Remember at the beginning when we talked about those ground nesters and you're looking for those tiny little holes in the ground that are about the diameter of a straw, and they're generally in those dry sites with bare vegetation? Those also tend to be the areas where you think to yourself, oh my gosh, I got to get my sprinkler on that because my grass isn't growing very well. If you see those little holes in there and then you throw the sprinkler on there, you are drowning out those ground nesting pollinators. So maybe designate a specific area around your house where you see those, where you choose to not water that for a while and you choose to let it be bare ground and let it have sparse vegetation until next season. So avoid overwatering. Let's see. I already mentioned the snags and the downwoody debris. If you have a snag in your backyard or a tree that fell down and there's a portion of it that you're comfortable leaving, try to do that. And then once again, be okay with messy. Be okay with leaving some of those stems standing and leaving some debris and garden clutter where you can. All right, so the third one is provide additional good quality habitat. So we touched on this a lot when we talked about what pollinators need, and that's really the pay attention to bloom time, plant mostly native, plant as high a diversity as you can, and provide that nesting and overwintering habitat. So some tips for success on this though, if you're providing additional good quality habitat, so this would be new habitat that you're adding on to what you already have. A big recommendation is to start small. You can add on each year or each season as you want to, but it's pretty common for people to get in over their heads when they start with new pollinator plots. So it's also really easy for pollinator plots to be overtaken with noxious weeds and become a maintenance nightmare. So make sure you start small and you do the site prep that's necessary and you're not biting off more than you can chew. I'd also recommend being conscientious of your neighbors. We've talked tonight about being okay with messy, but your neighbors may not have gotten the same message, and they may not appreciate what your garden looks like in the winter. And to some extent, I'd say, oh, well, it's your property, but then I'd also say they're your neighbors. And it doesn't hurt to have a conversation with them, let them know what you're doing, or maybe make some compromises on where you choose to put that pollinator plot that you're gonna let be messy. You should also consider things like your HOA requirements. If you live in a subdivision with an HOA, they may have specifics written in your covenants or your CCRs about your lawn care and your maintenance, things like that. There may also be, depending on where you live, city zoning regulations that would require you to have specific landscaping in specific areas. For example, if you live in downtown Kalispell, that area right next to the street, that's an easement to the city, and you're required to have lawn and several trees of specific species. So that may not be an option for you to convert into a pollinator plot. When you're selecting your site for adding on new habitat, a couple of obvious suggestions is don't pick somewhere that's going to be too steep. Don't pick somewhere that's going to be flooded or conversely too dry. Kind of want to pick somewhere that's going to work for what you can do. So if you can get irrigation out to a site, that might increase your ability where you can put your site. And then also just pay attention to what you've got going on in your neighborhood. If you live next to an agricultural field, it might be worth looking into whether they use insecticides, because if they do, you're not going to want to put your pollinator plot right next to that area. So just a couple of common sense guidelines there. All right, I'm going to scoot along now and talk about the Flathead Pollinator Initiative. This is one of the landowner assistance programs that we offer here at the district, and we're pretty excited about this one. It's our first year doing this program, and in a nutshell, this is a program where we offer free seed to local residents in Flathead County. The seed is a mix that is both native and non-native. It's mostly native, like we talked about, but there are a few non-native species in there that basically act as a cover crop. They come up right away and they help outcompete those weeds and give the native plants time to come in and take over eventually. So I believe we've got the seed list here. Yep, so this is the list of seeds or the list of species that is in our seed mix as part of that program. If you're interested in joining this program, we really encourage you to check out the information that's on our website, or we can talk about it more during discussion here in a few minutes. But to participate, essentially, we ask that you follow our site prep guidelines. We have a little booklet that we've put together that will walk you through step by step on what you need to do to prepare your site for a successful planting. And there are 3 options for that. You can do a tillage and herbicide, you can do just tillage, or you can do solarization to prepare your site. If you're interested in participating this fall, I'd recommend checking this information out right away or getting a hold of Samantha, the Conservation Program Manager, because you will need, particularly for the solarization, you'll need all summer to get your site ready for a fall planting. And if you're interested in that, fall plantings are really recommended. They can be very successful, and to some extent they can even be more successful than spring planting, just because of the nature of many of our native seeds. A lot of our native seeds need to go through a freeze-thaw cycle over the winter before they will germinate in the spring. So yeah, check it out and let us know if you have any questions on that. Check my notes, make sure I didn't forget anything. Okay. So I wanted to mention just a couple of additional resources for you guys. I've mentioned the Xerces Society several times, and I've mentioned this book several times. I strongly recommend the information that they have. They are experts in their field, and their website is always very up to date and has a lot of the latest research and information. And this book is one of the most practically applicable books I've ever had the pleasure of coming across. It's quite wonderful. So if you're looking for any individual book on pollinators and creating pollinator habitat, that book is the one that I would recommend the most strongly. I also want to just throw out quickly a note on checking your sources when it comes to pollinators. There's a lot of drama and social marketing out there that may not have the best facts behind it. So just because you saw something on social media or on Pinterest doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be your best bet. For that, I'm referring to a lot of the do-it-yourself instructions for creating alternative habitat or those artificial nest boxes. A lot of the posts that I've seen on Pinterest, for example, have not been very accurate in describing what pollinators need. So I strongly recommend that you check out a verified peer-reviewed source, such as those found on the Xerces Society for your information. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Michaela for our discussion session.
All right, thank you, Haley. So right now we don't have anybody posting any questions. So if people have a question, you should be able to unmute yourself now. And then we just ask after you unmute yourself to mute yourself again so we can answer. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jean's friend. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
We get our petunias mostly, maybe something else from Costco.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we've also gotten things from Lowe's, different places. But it's hard to know about the what they have done to the plants before you buy them. So if we're not using any chemicals after we buy things, will they be okay, or do we need to buy from specific places? That's one question I have.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So in general, places like the hardware store or your local gardening centers, they may be using herbicides, but they don't often use insecticides. So I'm gonna say in general, you're probably gonna be okay, but I would stick with, if you can, the more local nurseries, because they're gonna actually be able to answer those questions for you. If you go to somewhere like the gardening center at Home Depot or Lowe's, the staff there isn't gonna even be able to probably tell you where the plants came from, let alone what they were treated with. But chances are a more local nursery will be able to answer those questions for you. But broad statement, you're probably okay as far as insecticides go.
We have a question that came up in the chat of why is there yarrow in the Pollinator Initiative seed mix?
Good question. So there is a noxious weed, yarrow, that we need to be careful of, but there is also a native yarrow that we have. And so obviously the yarrow seed that we have included in this mix is the native, and it's a great pollinator species because it has a long bloom time, and the shape of the flower, where it's got a whole bunch of little flowers that create a big, I forget what that's called. It's got like a big landing pad on it, basically. It attracts a lot of different pollinators and is a really good one.
We have another question in the chat, or a request asking you to talk a little bit more about the horticultural vinegar.
Great, okay. So horticultural vinegar you can find at some hardware stores, some gardening centers. Like I know I've seen it at Murdoch's. And basically it is a really strong vinegar. It's much stronger than the distilled white vinegar you would find at the grocery store. So basically it's an acid. It's an acid that you can spray onto your plants, and the areas that are active and growing, basically the green areas of the plant, it burns them, particularly when they're exposed to sunlight. So during the heat of the day, you could put that horticultural vinegar into a spray bottle and spray the green parts of your plants, and it will harm them, basically. It will not kill them off. This is another one where I've seen a lot of recipes on Pinterest where you can combine vinegar and Epsom salt and Dawn dish soap, and it will kill your weeds. Well, it'll harm the plant that's on the surface, but it won't necessarily take out the root, and it definitely won't kill off any of the seeds that are lying dormant in that seed bed. So horticultural vinegar is something that can be used to spot spray, for example, if you just have a couple of weeds coming up that you don't want to hand pull. It's one option that you can use, but you do want to use it with caution since it is an acid. If you apply too much of it over the long term, it could change the pH of your soil. So it's an option, but to be used with caution.
We have another question of what do you recommend for solarization material?
Right, so solarization material, we generally recommend clear UV tarping. So this is the kind of tarping that you would use on a greenhouse. So it's gonna stand up against UV. It's not gonna fall apart and crumble quickly. And we recommend the clear plastic because you want that greenhouse effect, except amplified. So you're gonna lay it out in your area and stake it down so that the heat can't escape. And you're hoping that as the sun comes through that material, it heats up the soil and the vegetation to the point where it kills it off. Some people say to use black tarping, but what we've found through research is that the black material itself gets very hot, but it actually provides shade to the soil. So the soil isn't getting as hot as it should. And that's kind of the opposite of what you want. You want the heat to pass through the plastic material and get trapped against the ground greenhouse effect. So you can find that clear material at some of the local hardware stores and places like Murdoch's and ag centers. You'll just have to ask specifically for the UV clear plastic. Let them know that you're looking for essentially greenhouse material.
All right, we have another question. How big of an area should we start with for pollinator habitat?
Oh, well, that depends on how much time you want to put into it and what material you're using. So if you have a lot of time on your hands, you can start with a pollinator plot that's as small as a couple of pots on your back deck. If you want to bite off more than that and you've got the time for it to do the proper site prep, we recommend, or I should say we provide seed for an area of up to 2,500 square feet. We don't provide seed through our program for larger areas than that because we find that generally people bite off more than they can chew and they don't have time to do the proper site prep or they don't have time to maintain it in the future. And the last thing we want is to invest in a pollinator plot that doesn't take off, doesn't succeed, and eventually just becomes noxious weeds. So start small, but judge the space that you've got. Keep in mind that you can always add on later in the fall or next spring.
Great. We have a few more questions that came in the discussion box, and also people feel free, you can also ask over the video chat as well, but I'll just keep going with some of these. When using solarization, will the tarping kill the organisms below the surface, the good organisms?
Okay. Yeah, so the solarization will have an impact on the microorganisms and some of the other things in your soil for about 2 inches down into that soil. But it will not have a detrimental impact to the things that are lower down than that. So if you're worried about your long-term soil health and those microorganisms and all your beneficial bugs, for the most part, they're going to be fine because they're going to be in the deeper layers of soil.
Great. We also have, is it a good idea to amend with compost before planting?
That's a tough one. Before you do any soil amendments, I'd really strongly recommend that you do a soil sample. And if you have questions about how to do a soil sample or what that process looks like, we can talk about that, or there's some information on our website. But one of the dangers of amending with compost or fertilizer or manure, anything like that, right before you put seeds down, is sometimes it can be too rich for those emerging seeds and can actually be detrimental to them in the long run. If you think about the habitats where our native seeds are growing, they're not growing in highly fertile fields that have been composted or treated regularly. They're growing out on the mountain slopes that generally are fairly low in some of those nutrients. So providing too much can have the opposite effect and cause problems. So I'd err on the side of caution if doing that, and I would get your soil tested first. If your soil comes back as really low in, say, nitrates or some other component, then you could get a fertilizer and apply it specifically to fix that issue.
Great. It looked like Gail raised your hand. You want to go ahead and ask your question?
I was wondering if there's a certain shape for the garden that lends itself more to success, or can it be like the perimeter of your fenced garden, or is it more of a plot, or what? I'm trying to visualize.
Yeah. So kind of two parts to this answer. Any pollinator habitat is better than no pollinator habitat, right? So work with the space that you've got. And if the space that you've got or the space that's gonna work best for you is in a long strip or as a perimeter around your garden, then go ahead and do that. There's no reason you shouldn't. but there is some data showing that plants that are clustered together will mean less travel distance for certain pollinators that will target specific plants. So what I mean is a lot of bees are plant specific during certain times. So a bee will be pollinating a cherry tree, for example, and it will go from cherry tree to cherry tree to cherry tree. And so if it has to travel a long distance between those trees, it's using more energy. So you can clump things together to some extent to help the bees out. But if we're talking about a fairly small area, it's not going to make a whole lot of difference one way or the other on that scale. If we were talking about a major field and you only had, you know, one plant that was available on this side and another plant that was available on the other side, that could cause issues. But for the home gardener, I'd say don't worry about it. Just do what makes sense for your property. Oh, Michaela, you're muted.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat box. I have several large lavender plants that the bees seem to love. They're getting old and I would likely need to replace them the next year or two. Should I hang on to them as long as the bees are showing them love, or should I replace them with native plants now?
Great question. So my recommendation to that would be that if you felt you had to get rid of those lavenders because they're getting too old or they're outgrowing their space, I would wait until early spring. So the thinking behind that is that they would continue to provide forage habitat this summer, and then through the fall and winter, they would provide some overwintering and nesting habitat. And then just in early spring, as all the insects are starting to break dormancy and things are just about to start greening up, that's when you could make the switch to a new plant. So that'd be a good time for planting something new, but you'd also make sure that you weren't accidentally damaging some overwintering habitat with some bees still in it.
All right, we have another question, I believe in regards to our pollinator initiative, is if we do site inspections, which I can answer, and we do. If you are interested in the pollinator initiative, we actually require a site visit before we provide the seed to talk about how you can prepare your plot. And so again, you can contact the Conservation District, and either Samantha or myself will complete a site inspection and talk with you about getting pollinator habitat started. Let's see.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you purchase the seed if you do not live in Flathead County?
Can I ask what county you do live in?
Lake.
Lake County has their own pollinator initiative. I was hoping you were going to say Lake County.
Oh, really?
We have the same program, so you just need to contact the Lake County Conservation District.
Okay, I will do that. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, we have another question for fall planting, when is the best time?
So really any time in the fall after the growing season is over would work well. There's actually a strategy you can use too that's called overseeding or frost seeding, which is when you would seed after the first snowfall. And this can be beneficial because the seed sits on top of that snow and the seed is slightly darker color and it will get warmed by the sun and fall through that snow layer, and then the snow will evenly pack it down onto the ground for germination next spring. So you can go pretty late into the fall, even after we're starting to get some snow, but I'd make sure to do it, wait until after a growing season is over, because you don't want it to be competing with any of the existing vegetation that's still growing.
We have another question of, are most of the seeds either perennial or self-seeding?
Great, so there's a mixture of both in our seed mix. I wonder if I can pull that back up real quick. Hang on, let's go back up to, okay, so over here in this column, can you guys see my mouse cursor? Yeah, okay. So over here is the, shows which ones are perennial and which ones are annual. So a lot of these, it's about a 50-50 mix of the ones that are going to self-seed and the ones that are going to, you know, perennial versus annual. So what I will say is that some of the annual ones, like this biennial one here, the Black-Eyed Susan, the individual plant, it will grow for several years before that plant dies, and it will also seed itself. So it's kind of a mix of perennial and annual. A couple of them have those similar characteristics.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
We have a few empty boxes yet in our vegetable garden, and we were thinking maybe we could put some seeds in there. When they reseed, how much do they spread?
If they're in a containerized plant box, you may see one or two pop up somewhere else in your garden, but it's not going to be unmanageable. It'd be something that you would, you know, just like any other weed would be in your garden bed, you'd see it and pull it out if you didn't want it there. Nothing that we have in our seed mix is so aggressive that it's going to take over an area. But they will spread. Like we planted some pollinators in our demonstration garden here on site, and all the way across the site, I had a flower pop up that just in the middle of the gravel area. So.
Gail, you can go ahead. You raise your hand.
I have two questions. How deer resistant are these pollinator gardens? Do they need to be fenced or not? And secondly, sunflowers are in the mix. Is that going to be a bear attractant?
Oh, good question. So the deer question first. There are some species that the deer will get to, but what we've heard from program participants is that there's not yet been a case where the deer have gone in and annihilated the whole thing. They'll go in and they'll munch on a few, but they don't target it like they do your petunias or some of your other cultivars that you've got around the house. So they do not need fenced. We definitely don't require that. I don't think it's necessary. Yeah. As far as the bear question, I don't think that the sunflowers will be too much of a bear attractant. The sunflowers are not roasted or seasoned like they, you know, if you had commercial grade sunflowers like you find in bird food mixes, that's definitely a bear attractant. But I'm not familiar with bears getting into, I don't recall sunflowers being a major food source for bears and something that they target. That makes sense?
Yes.
Yes.
We have another question of, what are your thoughts on diatomaceous earth to control ants? I might have said that incorrectly.
So my thoughts are that that question is beyond me, and I apologize for that. I'm not familiar at all with using diatomaceous earth to control ants, but sounds interesting, and I'm willing to look into it since I currently have ants eating all my strawberries.
Well, those are all the questions in the chat. So if anyone else has any more questions, please feel free to go ahead and ask.
I would just like to remind everyone that we have that survey. Michaela, did you post a link to the survey in the chat, or would you mind?
I will go ahead and
I
do
don't know
that.
how to get to the chat.
So the chat should be down at the bottom of your screen. There's a little bubble. And here, what I'll do, I don't know how to send this to everybody, but this, here, I'll share my screen with you guys real quick again. See if I can find it. Oh, that's not it. There it is. Can you guys see this?
I think it's taken a moment to.
And share. Okay. So this is the survey. It's only a couple of questions long. If you guys are willing, we would really appreciate you guys filling this out. The funding that is helping us to put on this workshop series is through a grant, and we're required to do surveys. So as part of that grant funding. So we would appreciate your feedback. We also do use your information and your feedback to improve our webinars as we go. We had a couple of workshops last year and got some really good feedback from people, and use that information to update this webinar. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're willing to fill that out. There's a link in the comment box. If you're having trouble finding that chat or comment box, just let us know.
All right, we have another question that just came up, asking about solarization killing mode knapweed.
That knapweed is tenacious. The solarization will be better than nothing. But as far as knapweed goes, herbicide treatment is going to be your best option. The unfortunate side of knapweed is that it will maintain seeds in the seed bed for decades. So even if you manage to kill off all of the knapweed that you see on the surface, the moment you disturb that ground and expose to the sunlight, more knapweed will come back up.
Do we have any more questions at all?
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. I really appreciate it. If you think of something later on that you are dying to ask a question for, you can get a hold of us here at the office, or you can message us on Facebook. We check that fairly regularly. And yeah, we look forward to chatting with you. And if any of you are interested in taking advantage of the Pollinator Initiative program, we recommend that you do so.
Yes, and again, all the resources that Haley mentioned, we will provide in a comprehensive resource document, as well as a recording of this presentation if you want to refer back to anything, and we'll post that on our website and most likely Facebook as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.